In the middle to late 1850s, San Francisco had scores of bookstores, many which advertised themselves as selling new and used books, as well as stationery and sundry items. According to the business directories, in 1860, there were about 60 bookstores in San Francisco. And when you consider how small San Francisco was at that time, that was quite a concentration of booksellers. And obviously, it was a very competitive environment. Into this competitive environment comes our next hero, Hubert Pal Bancroft, who was born in 1832 in Central Ohio. As a teenager, Bancroft began to work as a traveling door-to-door bookseller, and by 1848, he was working in a bookshop in Buffalo, New York. Quite a dashing figure, isn't he? He's got that top hat and a cane. In 1850, Bancroft's father came to California seeking gold, and Hubert soon followed with the idea of going into the book business. There were some false starts, and he even returned to New York at one point, but in 1856, H.H. Bancroft and Company opened on Montgomery Street. Over time, Bancroft became much more than just a bookseller. He was an avaricious book and manuscript collector, an important publisher, similar to Roman, an historian, an editor, and of course, his legacy lives on today at the University of California. In 1870, Bancroft completed the Bancroft Building on Market Street, one of the only booksellers to ever build his own building in San Francisco, or most other American cities for that matter. Between 3rd and 4th Streets, a handsome 5-story structure with retail sales on the first floor, above which housed the business offices, print shop, bindery, the famous History Factory, where staff of writers and researchers wrote the well-known historical works for which his firm became so famous, and on the top floor was Bancroft's personal library. Now here's the, he stopped being H.H. Bancroft and went to A.L., that's his brother, who he brought in. He actually announces it up here in the letterhead. And there's his new business on Market Street. Bancroft had become, in 14 years, the largest book-selling firm west of the Mississippi. For his personal collection, Bancroft scoured the world of auctions and bookstores on the East Coast, in Mexico, in Europe, and even down the street. Bancroft could often be found browsing the shelves at Heaps Ellery Bookstore, among other local secondhand bookshops. By 1890, Bancroft's personal library, containing 65,000 volumes and approximately 100,000 manuscripts, had been moved to its own specifically designed library building at 1538 Valencia Street, close today to what would be Cesar Chavez. By the turn of the century, Bancroft began efforts to sell his collection en bloc, and in 1905, he was sold to the University of California and moved from Valencia Street to Berkeley, just months ahead of the earthquake and fire, in which the Bancroft building on Market Street was, like so many other buildings around it, was consumed in flames. Now there's a sort of monthly bulletin they would publish. Here's some of his book tickets. And they dressed the building up once for some kind of event or parade. It's the wildest thing. It makes you dizzy to look at it. It's just. They were they wanted to do lots of things, zincography, so they were printing. After the earthquake and fire, Bancroft did not personally return to the book and publishing business, but they did rebuild the Bancroft building on Market Street, a 6-story structure in the same location as the previous building, which stands right across the street from my shop. And if you're ever on that side of Market Street, in the lobby, there's a nice little historical display about the Bancroft Company. I highly recommend it. Bancroft died in 1918 at the age 86. That was his last library on Valencia Street. One of the most interesting booksellers from the 1880s and 90s, whose distinctive style greatly influenced future San Francisco booksellers, was William Doxey. William Doxey was born in 1845 in England, moved to San Francisco in 1871. By 1875, he was working at the Bancroft Company as the manager of retail sales, and by 1881, he had the funds to establish his own bookshop. Doxey was obviously a man of great taste and was himself an accomplished collector. His bookstore catered to the so-called carriage trade and specialized in fine bindings and the likes of Riviere, Zaehnsdorf, Tout, and Cobden Sanderson. He featured illustrated books, the titles from small publishers like Stone and Kimball, Way and Williams, Thomas Bard Mosier, and the Bodley Head. Doxey's shop was the focal point of the fin de siècle 90s style in the San Francisco book world. His stores, first at 631 Market Street, then on DuPont Street, which is Grant Street today, and later in the Palace Hotel, were without question the most fashionable and cosmopolitan bookshops in San Francisco. Doxey published over 50 books under his own imprint, many of which are examples of fine bookmaking for which San Francisco would become famous. He also published perhaps the most legendary of all San Francisco magazines, The Lark. Now here's Doxey's first book. It was a guide, I think, done in '83 to San Francisco and Yosemite. Here's a list of books for Christmas 1892, which has, this is from the San Francisco Public Library collections, I've never seen this anywhere else, which had these nice photographs of his shop inside of it. There you go. I'd like to go back there. Doxey was outgoing and well-connected. He was a member of the Bohemian Club, the Yacht Club, California Library Association, but alas, he was evidently not a good businessman, and to make matters worse, he was also apparently generous to a fault. Doxey went through a few bankruptcies, and in about 1902 he left San Francisco, but his influence on the San Francisco book world remained, as we shall see. There's The Lark, and there's another little Doxey piece. Our next subject is Patrick Joseph Healy, a name little known today, but Robert Cowan claimed in his History of San Francisco Booksellers that Healy was, quote, perhaps the most widely known bookseller San Francisco has ever had, end quote. And certainly in his time, Healy was one of the most interesting and colorful of our antiquarian booksellers. Healy, born in Ireland in 1836, came to San Francisco in 1869. He initially worked in numerous blue-collar jobs. He was a janitor, a teamster, he delivered newspapers, until he saved up enough money to open his first bookshop in January 1883 at 104 O'Farrell Street. In a world where books were plentiful, Healy was a voracious buyer, and soon his inventory outgrew his small shop. He moved across the street to a larger space, and one that was so narrow it became known as the Tunnel. Some years later, Healy's The Tunnel was immortalized in a racing novel by Anne Knox entitled The Lay-Ho Kitty, and I think she met some of her customers in the tunnel. Healy is a notable figure for several reasons. He issued catalogs, something few of his contemporary San Francisco booksellers did. He was an early enthusiast for Californiana, which brought him to the attention of Bancroft and later Cowan, both of whom frequented his shops. And Healy was the first dealer we know of in California to emphasize the value of pamphlet material. In 1897, Healy sold his entire shop, then at 829 Mission Street, to Robert Cowan. But he did not retire. Healy continued to sell books out of his home in Noe Valley for almost 25 years. Here's a catalog Healy did when he had a partner briefly in 1893, with a partnership with Daly. 40 pages, double columns, about 1,500 items, quote, of standard and new second-hand books embracing works relating to and published on the Pacific Coast, Americana, theology, Ireland and the Irish, biography, travel, literature, poetry, philosophy, first editions of English and American authors, scientific, practical, and miscellaneous. Many, and here we look at, this is an advertisement Healy had in a directory for 1880, I think it's about 89 or 88, advertising himself as books specializing relating to California, a specialty. That's the earliest advertisement for any books like that. They really say, I specialize in Californiana. And here's the catalog. As I say earlier, he obviously, he stayed in business for a long time. He squirreled some things away, and there was a sale in 1911 of a lot of his books. So Healy remained in the book trade in the periphery for a long time. Many believe that Bancroft was the greatest San Francisco bookseller of his generation, and he certainly was the grandest and the most financially the most successful. But surely of equal stature is Robert Ernest Cowan, who in many ways got his start and early encouragement from Bancroft. Cowan was born in 1862 in Toronto, but early in his childhood, his family moved to San Francisco, where he was raised in the Mission District. He was apparently a studious young man and became interested in books and Western history while in college. No sooner was he collecting books than he was making systematic lists of his collections, lists that would in the future become published bibliographies. Bancroft took a liking to the young biblioscholar and allowed Cowan his use of his collections for research. Cowan became well known in the local bookshops, which he constantly perused in search of new material. In 1895, with his own collections and some books purchased en bloc from other booksellers, particularly Healy, Cowan went into business for himself as Robert E. Cowan, dealer in old and new books, at 211A Powell Street. Within a few years, he moved several times, expanding with every move. His last shop in downtown was the one he bought from Patrick Joseph Healy at 829 Mission Street, right where the Fifth and Mission Garage is today. And he made the fortuitous decision in 1902 to move his inventory home out to Treat Avenue in the Mission District, which meant that he was spared the fire that followed the earthquake. It also meant that Cowan's books were suddenly in great demand after the fire from those whose libraries and collections had been destroyed.